This week, it's safe to say nothing in spaceflight felt theoretical. 4 astronauts we know and love finally left low Earth orbit for the very first time. They flew farther from home than any human in history. They swung around the back of the moon, watched a solar eclipse from deep space, and are now coasting home. They had a leaky toilet, plenty of teary moments, and some of the best views of all time. We have all that and more in today's episode. So without further delay, my name is Connor, and welcome to an especially amazing episode of Spaceflight News. We start with the story that defined the week, and arguably the decade so far, Artemis II. On April 1st, NASA launched Artemis II from Kennedy Space Center. On board was Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. It was the first crewed flight of the SLS, first crewed flight of Orion, first crewed mission towards the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972. And as we all know, this was not a landing. That's the point. Artemis II is a proving mission. The flight is designed to test the full deep space architecture with people on board, before NASA commits to anything harder on the lunar surface. A day after launch, Orion fired its service engine module for about 6 minutes, the translunar injection burn, and then broke free from Earth for the first time since 1972. And then on April 6, Orion finally entered the lunar sphere of influence, the point at which the moon's gravity pulls harder on the spacecraft than the Earth does. Christina Koch said it perfectly. We're now falling to the moon rather than rising from Earth. Pretty simple. A few hours later, the crew broke the all-time human distance record. Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen surpassed Apollo 13's mark of 248,655 miles from the Earth's surface, eventually reaching a maximum distance of 252,706 miles. Then came the flyby itself. During a planned 40-minute loss of signal, as Orion passed behind the moon, the spacecraft made its closest approach at about 4,067 miles above the lunar surface. The crew watched an Earth set, then an Earth rise on the opposite leg, and then finally, in an almost unfairly cinematic fashion, they received a nearly hour-long solar eclipse as the Orion capsule, the moon, and the sun all aligned, giving the crew a view of the solar corona glowing around the darkened moon. They even reported 6 light flashes from meteoroids striking the lunar surface. And now the mission has flipped. The lunar observation period is over, and the crew is on their return trip home. On Tuesday, April 7th, Orion exits the lunar sphere of influence at roughly 41,000 miles from the moon, with splashdown in the Pacific Ocean expected on Friday evening. On top of all of that, there is one more dimension worth pausing on. Artemis II is also a major international mission. Orion is flying with ESA's European Service Module, the hardware that provides propulsion, power, thermal control, air, and water for the crew. So this isn't just NASA returning to deep space. It's the clearest real-world example of how the next era of exploration is being built through extensive partnership. The second story this week was a bit less dramatic, but it was structurally important. NASA released its fiscal year of 2027 budget request, and the headline isn't really the document. It's what the document confirms. Moon to Mars remains the agency's central strategic framework, with mandatory appropriations continuing to back Artemis, Mars, and the broader Moon-Mars effort through 2032. That doesn't solve every hardware or schedule problem, but it does tell you something. Even as the details are evolving and changing, NASA is still treating the lunar return and Mars preparation as the spine for its long-range direction. The third story now belongs to Europe. ESA's Celeste mission has begun testing a low Earth orbit navigation layer, designed to complement Galileo. And this matters because of where navigation is going next. A system in low Earth orbit improves resilience, adds flexibility, and it strengthens Europe's positioning, navigation, and timing capability in an increasingly contested orbital environment. There were no Starship flight this week. Bummer, and that's worth stating a bit more clearly. The progress was all around the ground. At Starbase, SpaceX keeps moving forward towards Flight 12 by testing Booster 19 on the new Pad 2 infrastructure. The campaign includes pad commissioning, cryogenic loading, and a short static fire. The static fire ended early, and the current read is that the issue was on the ground side rather than a major booster failure. On the surface, this sounds minor. The deeper signal isn't though. SpaceX is no longer just trying to get Starship off the pad, it's trying to turn Starship into a launch system. New pad, new booster generation, Raptor 3 hardware, and faster operations all around. The ground systems are built to eventually support a much higher flight tempo than any system on Earth, orders of magnitude faster than the nearest closest competitor. This is the industrialization phase of the lunar and Mars colonization projects. And of course, it's what matters. Because if Starship is ever going to support lunar logistics, tanker flights, orbital refueling, and eventually Mars, it can't stay a spectacular test vehicle. It has to become repeatable infrastructure that we completely forget about. But the reality check still of course applies. The hardest milestones are still ahead. True orbital insertion, reliable re-entry on a consistent basis, on-orbit propellant transfer, which by the way has never been tested, tanker operations at scale, and the full mission chain required for lunar support systems. So the honest summary is something like this. The program is of course moving forward, but mostly through infrastructure and system work. The architecture is getting more serious while the most difficult flight demonstrations are still on the horizon. Of course, there's going to be tons of more chaos, drama, and excitement in the Starship development cycle, but for now, that's pretty far away. First, on March 30th, SpaceX launched the Transporter 16 rideshare mission from Vandenberg. Falcon 9 delivered 119 payloads into Sun synchronous orbit, continuing one of the most important services in the modern launch market. Frequent, predictable access to orbit for a range of smaller spacecraft. Notable rides on board includes Verida's 6th re-entry capsule. Also on March 30th, SpaceX flew another batch of 29 Starlink satellites from Cape Canaveral. The bigger headline was the booster though. That Falcon 9 first stage flew for a record 34th time, and it landed successfully. At this point, this isn't really just a SpaceX milestone. Rather, it's a reflection about the rest of the industry and what the one company has managed to launch itself into compared to everyone else. And finally, early on April 4th, ULA launched Amazon Leo's 5 on the Atlas V rocket. The rocket carried 29 satellites and set a new record for the Atlas V program. Both the heaviest payload it has ever flown and for the largest number of satellites it has ever carried in a single mission. That matters, of course, for two reasons. First, Amazon is steadily building out one of the world's largest future broadband constellation networks. And second, Atlas V is approaching the end of its career. That's pretty sad. And it's still managing to set records on the way out? Pretty sick. So the launch picture had 4 clean layers this week. Transporter 16 showed the strength of the rideshare economy. The Starlink mission showed how mature reusable rockets have become. Atlas V proved that even veteran rockets can leave the stage commanding authority. And Artemis II reminded the world what a genuinely historic mission really feels like. And with that, that's all we have time for this week. Okay, this is going to be an especially conversational episode of Spaceflight News because I am getting Claude to rewrite this after a long night of coding. And now I need to go to sleep not long after this episode. So, for all of you Spaceflight fans out there, make sure to get your sleep because the stars are very far and it is a long journey and you need your rest for this long adventure we all have before us. So get ready, bright eyes and bushy tails, and I'll see you all for space camp tomorrow morning. Okay, all right. Goodbye.